Hello everyone and welcome back. When we talk about inclusion in exhibitions, we often ask whose stories are represented. But there is another question that can be even more revealing, which is whose voice is missing. Because a person can be present in a historical record without ever really being allowed to speak. They may appear in a census, in a wage book, in a medical file, in a photograph, but are we actually hearing them? Or are we only really hearing what somebody else has to say about them? So a useful way to audit exhibitions when you are representing human voices is to ask a series of questions. Who speaks? Who is spoken about? And who do we only hear through somebody else's voice? And I thought we should go through some of these questions and points today. And as always, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and add your comments below. Let's have a look at these. The first question is, who actually speaks? So start with the voice visitors encounter directly. Whose words are quoted? Whose letters, diaries, interviews, or testimonies are included? Now that can be obviously museums experts or institutions. It can also be politicians, landowners, military leaders, or wealthy families, and so on. And who is mainly described by those people? So imagine, let's say, an exhibition about a large country estate. You may have letters, you may have account books, portraits, diaries from the family who owned it. But what about the servants, the laborers, the tenants, or children who also lived and worked there? They may be everywhere in the history without ever appearing in the narrative voice. So ask who gets to describe their own experience and who is always described by someone else. That can immediately reveal where an exhibition may be unbalanced. The second thing to look for is people who appear mainly as statistics or groups. We often encounter phrases such as 12 servants or 47 casualties or 300 enslaved workers, female employees, the poor, immigrants, patients. Those numbers and categories matter. They tell us about scale, but they can also make individual lives disappear. Sometimes the surviving evidence may be very small. Perhaps we only know a name or an age, an occupation, but even that can sometimes move somebody from being a category back towards being a person. So statistics tell us scale. Individual traces remind us that every number represents a life. So a useful question can be to ask whether some of the groups in your exhibition can occasionally be brought back to individual human experience. The third thing is, who created the evidence? And this question is especially important. Historical records are not neutral. Sometimes the only surviving information about a person was created by someone with power over them. It can be an employer, a doctor, a police officer, a government official, a slave owner. I may also add to this list in terms of women's history, a husband or a father. Women rarely have their own voices in history. A medical file, for example, may contain a great deal of information about a patient while telling us almost nothing about how that patient understood their own experience. So whenever we use these sources, we should ask, whose perspective are we actually reading? What did the person creating the record care about? What did they fail to record because it did not matter to them? This does not mean we cannot use those sources, of course. Often they are the only thing we have, but interpretation should make the nature of that evidence visible rather than presenting it as a complete account. The fourth point is, what do we do when the voice really is missing? Sometimes we simply do not have someone's own words. So what can we do? We can look at the traces around them, objects, buildings, census records, court records, inventories, photographs, archaeology, family records, or later oral histories. And sometimes these traces allow us to reconstruct parts of a life. But this is where interpretation needs to be very clear about the difference between what we know, what we can reasonably infer, and what we simply cannot know. And this last category matters because there can be a temptation to fill silence with invented emotions. I think we have probably all seen exhibitions with writing in the first person, such as, I hated this work, or I dreamt of leaving, or I was very afraid. And those things may be entirely plausible, but unless the evidence tells us that, we do not actually know. And giving someone a voice should not mean inventing one for them. We can create empathy without pretending that we have access to a person's private thoughts. And sometimes honesty about uncertainty is actually much more powerful. The last thing I wanted to add is sometimes the missing voice actually is the story. It is part of the history. Why do we know so much about one person and almost nothing about another? Sometimes it is chance, a surviving letter, a diary doesn't survive, a building burns, a family throws records away, and sometimes the silence reflects power. Who could read and write? Who had the money and status to preserve family papers? Whose possessions entered museum collections? Whose experiences were recorded by institutions? Whose words were considered important enough to keep and whose were not? An archive or a museum does not preserve everyone equally. Sometimes the question is not simply, why did this person leave no voice behind? It may also be, why was their voice never recorded, collected, or preserved in the first place? And that absence can tell visitors something very important about class, gender, race, wealth, literacy, institution, and indeed historical power. So if you want to audit whose voices are present in an exhibition, ask who speaks, who's spoken about, who appears only as statistics, whose experience survives through somebody else's records, and whose absence should we acknowledge rather than try to fill. Because giving someone a voice does not mean finding a quotation, and it certainly doesn't mean that we should invent one. Sometimes it means making the surviving traces visible. Sometimes it means explaining who created the evidence. Sometimes it means being honest about what we cannot know, and there will always be gaps. We cannot know everything. And sometimes the most important interpretation is simply showing visitors why that voice is missing at all. I would love to hear your thoughts about this, and if you have any examples to share from exhibitions, that would be really nice to see as well. So please share your thoughts below, and thanks for tuning in.